Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to walk you through the challenges facing Canada's GDP and overall economic growth. Here's a bit of my agenda. I like to look at comparisons between countries, and I'll go into more specific details on Canada. Here's a brief bio about myself. As you can see, I have a background both in technology as well as Office of the Finance, working in corporate finance as a financial analyst to accountant. So I've held various roles both within finance as well as supporting it through IT solutions. Let's look at this chart here. So I pulled this down from the Trading Economics site. And basically what I did is I just looked at the GDP growth numbers between quarter 25, second quarter 2025 and first quarter 2025. So they're based on an annual basis. And I looked at the fastest growing ones. So as you can see here is like quarter over quarter, the fastest growing one that's changed the most is you look at Turkey, you look at South Korea, you look at Australia. These are countries that have seen sizable growth quarter over quarter. And this is interesting because in the second quarter is when we started seeing a lot of the pressure from the Trump policies on GDP growth, especially trade. And that gives you a good indication of what's going on. And the other thing is, as a Canadian, I look at the Canadian trends, and our growth or GDP is 50% of where it was in the first quarter. And we saw a spike up with exports and trade due to getting ahead of the tariff impact potential from Trump. So that led to a little bit more misleading growth in the first quarter. But it's been sluggish growth for a while. The systemic issues with the Canadian economy have been there well before Donald Trump took office. The second part of here you're seeing is I do the G7. I don't know why we put so much discussion on the G7 because the G7 doesn't have the same power as the G20, and the G20 is the one I look at the most. And as you can see, growth is like less than 2%. In some cases, we've been hovering at 1% for the G7 for almost over a year, and that's significant challenges facing all those countries. This is information I pulled out from Desjardins, and I use their information along with other banks and private sector as supporting my conclusions in my analysis. So as you can see here, you're looking at business confidence, you're actually looking at exports, and just looking at overall, what they look at real GDP growth in terms of where they see the trends. I do these charts too as well, and I took this again from Desjardins, but I overlaid in October 2024 numbers because what I've seen consistently since October 25 is 50% of Canada's GDP has been tied to three buckets, which is real estate, public sector, as well as oil and gas. I haven't seen significant uptick in the manufacturing sector. Mining either, which you would expect with Canada's resource sector, forestry and mining should play a more integral part. They have not for the last decade. I almost would say it's the last decade in those sectors. This also gives you a pretty good look at quarter over quarter. I looked at commodity prices too as well. And also, again, if you look at the average growth change, especially in the goods producing sector, it's faced a lot of challenges, and that's a critical sector in terms of wages, productivity, overall its contribution to the fiscal management cycle. This gives you some key metrics I do each month, and as you can see, I've estimated some of the metrics for August, but if you look at the ones where I'm seeing growth and change, the CPI came up a little bit, but it's still under the target, but food costs are still an issue with Canada. You look at retail sales, they've come up, oil production. My concern is when you start looking at where the decliners are, which are agricultural equipment, sawmill production. These are critical areas of the economy, and we've also seen some impact on canola around Chinese pressure as well. Where do I see the challenges? These challenges are the same challenges that have been existing for at least 5, 6 years. So they have nothing to do with Trump, but they are systemic issues. And I estimate that because of the lack of focus on trade outside the US, that it's probably cost the GDP 150 to 200 billion cumulative. And if I use a tax basis of 18 to say 30% of that tax base, I estimate on that baseline business that the government's lost between 30 billion up to 65 billion in lost taxes. We also need to put focus on that. Prime Minister Carney came out and prioritized 5 projects, but more needs to be done to get this capital doing it. Companies will invest where they get their return, and that's something to bear in mind. I've argued about port expansions beyond Montreal and Vancouver to areas like Sydney, Nova Scotia, Thunder Bay, because I believe to reduce some of the logjam and just more efficient throughput around the transportation systems, whether it's rail or trucking, it makes more sense to kind of do a more holistic view of where we want these ports and expansion. Canada's always struggled in terms of the equity market because we are a small capital, but some of it comes back to also policy, and private equity is critical to drive more and more investment in here, and that's something to bear in mind. Work is going into agriculture, adopting more technology in terms of expert um, vertical farming and just overall getting crop yields out, as well as being sensitive to the environment. There is a lot of talk around commitments on eliminating interprovincial barriers. They've been around and they stranglehold an economy for a while, and they need to be eliminated. Forming new trade agreements, alliances with countries, India, Saudi Arabia, is critical to diversify that, as well as leverage existing agreements that other governments struck. And I'm a big proponent of basically getting government's house in order. The era of big government needs to disappear. We need to go more to a digital model. We need to reduce the size of government. We need to get more efficiencies out of government. And we need to really look at how we operate as government as a whole. And of course, addressing the skills gaps means revamping education. This kind of gives you an example of this, and I'm only going to highlight this for a brief few seconds here, is that I highlighted GDP growth in November 2019 that was already challenged. And apart from 2017 when we saw like 3% growth, there was a decline in growth. And the growth of is concerning to me because in policy wide, there should have been more focus back then to address the systemic issues facing our natural resource sector, our agricultural and manufacturing sector, even our utility sector, a push of more balance around policies and just to drive those upticks because they would have generated more income. The other thing too, as I've argued too as well and discussed numerous times, is Canada's a natural resource rich country. There should be no reason why we're not top 5 in the world on GDP per capita, but we've seen a decline in that area. And that's something to bear in mind as well. This kind of gives you an idea of where the challenges are. So the government of Canada initially, when they came into power under Trudeau in 2015, the commitment was to run small deficits to address issues like productivity, trade, and stuff like that. That never really happened because, as you can see with the trends in terms of labor productivity, it's really for 10 years has declined and it hasn't really improved. And if you look at GDP growth, you know, after 2024 August, we're averaging 1.6. Yes, we faced the pandemic, but all governments have faced challenges. And you look at R&D. R&D, yes, there's been some challenges with that, but we still in key areas around AI, agricultural smart technology, mineral side, forestry. There's a lot of things that we could do better here that would support economic growth because typically economic growth is driven by innovation and no more needs to be done on the innovation side. So in summary, I'm not here to pick on any government, but to address things is going to take a multitude of policies, and it isn't something that will be fixed overnight. There needs to be more collaboration, and we can't just isolate just key sectors Because one of the growth areas I've seen more is in professional services and government, and that's just not sustainable. If you really want to create the wealth and create the opportunities, you need to be becoming more diversified and more broad range with policies to address the issues facing the Canadian economy. Thank you.